Good morning. It's Friday, January 10th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 462 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. A lot has been written about the bitter partisan atmosphere here in Washington. Democrats and Republicans are like Tom and Jerry, Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner, Hamilton and Burr, Obi-Wan Kenobi and Darth Vader. Okay, maybe I'm taking it all just a bit too far, but you get the point. But now here's the interesting thing. Reports at this moment suggest that outgoing National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan is coordinating closely with his soon-to-be replacement, Mike Waltz. They're coordinating on a possible Hamas hostage deal, the presidential elections in Lebanon, the threat posed by the regime in Iran, and more. This is good news, and not just because the two administrations can finally agree on the color of hummus. It all leaves little daylight for America's adversaries to exploit. Have we turned a corner here in DC? Let's not go crazy, but these are some positive signs. I'm going to take those wherever I can get them. Today's guest is Bonnie Glick. She served as a Foreign Service Officer at the State Department for 12 years, and then as the Deputy Administrator of the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, from January 2019 to November 2020 after being nominated by former and soon-to-be current President Donald Trump. Bonnie has since founded the Kroc Institute for Tech Diplomacy, the U.S.'s first ever tech tank at Purdue University. She's also an adjunct senior fellow at FDD. We're going to hear more from Bonnie in just a few short minutes, so hang tight for that. Lebanon's parliament elected a new president yesterday. His name is Joseph Aoun, and he's the commander of the Lebanese armed forces. Now, if all those breathless Middle East pundits are correct, Lebanon is about to become a functioning state after years of earning the title of worst basket case in a region brimming with basket cases. As the pundits see it, now that Aoun is in charge, the Lebanese armed forces are going to force Hezbollah to relinquish its stranglehold on the state. But if you believe that, I have a cedar-scented unicorn farm to sell you. The Lebanese political system is still broken, and the Lebanese armed forces, the LAF, are simply not ready to lock horns with Hezbollah. So sorry, folks, there's still a rough road ahead for Lebanon. But there is some good news. Lebanon has tried to elect a new president 12 times. Each time failed thanks to Hezbollah's parliamentary bloc, which sought to install its own candidate. Hezbollah voted for Aoun yesterday. Here's the other bit of good news. Aoun is widely seen as a close ally of the United States and Saudi Arabia. In his acceptance speech, he pledged to reform Lebanese institutions, address the country's economic crisis, and secure the state's monopoly on weapons, which was a clear reference to disarming Hezbollah. This will be a process, not an event. But if that process begins, we could be on a path to something other than a Hezbollah-Israel war every decade, and that would be a good thing indeed. Now for your headlines. Headline one, the U.S. military carried out more strikes against Houthi weapons depots in Yemen. On Wednesday, U.S. Central Command conducted multiple precision strikes targeting 2 underground storage facilities. CENTCOM did not specify where the strikes took place and did not confirm any Houthi casualties. But we do know that no American personnel were injured and no U.S. equipment sustained damage. That's good news. According to the Houthis, U.S. forces carried out 5 raids, they're calling it, in Yemen's northwest and 2 in the Sana'a province. This is the latest in a series of actions that the Biden administration has taken against the Houthis in recent weeks. A little bit at the last minute there. Last month, U.S. forces conducted at least 3 strikes against Houthi targets and thwarted multiple Houthi attacks on naval and merchant ships. That's all great, but the Houthis have been wreaking havoc in the Red Sea for over a year now. Maritime traffic is still hindered in this key waterway, and the Houthis continue to fire missiles at Israel, including 3 just yesterday. How much longer can this continue? Let's find out. Headline 2, a senior Iranian general admitted that Bashar al-Assad's ouster was a major blow for the Islamic Republic. Of course, I mean, we already knew this, but Iranian leaders have been downplaying the strategic impact of Assad's fall in the weeks since his regime collapsed. So now, last week, Iranian General Behrouz Esbati delivered a speech in Tehran during which he conceded that Iran suffered a major defeat when rebel forces toppled Assad in early December. Audio of the speech leaked on Monday. And it contains some juicy revelations. According to Esbati, Tehran had been pushing Assad to open another front against Israel. Iranian leaders even presented Assad with battle plans, but the Syrian dictator refused to comply, which strained relations between Tehran and Damascus. Esbati also accused Moscow of duping Tehran into believing that Russian jets were bombing Syrian rebels when they may have just been offloading bombs into open fields, which makes no sense to me. But hey, this is the Middle East. Headline 3, Poland has decided not to enforce the International Criminal Court's arrest warrant against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Previously, the Polish government threatened to arrest Netanyahu if he stepped foot in the country to participate in events commemorating the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp. But yesterday, Warsaw reversed that decision and announced that Netanyahu could travel to Poland worry-free. This is all welcome news, and I want to give a shout-out to my colleagues Cliff May and Peter Duran, who applied pressure on Warsaw, but sadly, it may not matter. Netanyahu isn't planning to attend the commemoration at the end of January, which is a shame given the historic importance, but let's get real. These bogus ICC charges need to be dropped completely, and the weaponization of international law needs to be regulated. Sadly, that's not happening anytime soon. The saga continues. Okay, and now with that, we're going to get to the interview here with Bonnie Glick. As I mentioned earlier, she has quite the biography from her 12-year stint as a Foreign Service officer with tours from Ethiopia to Nicaragua to her role as Deputy Administrator of the United States Agency for International Development to her founding of the country's inaugural tech tank. Bonnie has lots to say on lots of different topics, so let's get into it right now on the FDD Morning Brief. Welcome to the program, Bonnie Glick.
Thank you so much, Jonathan Schanzer. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Great to have you. All right, I want to just start with like a little bit of background, a little setting of the edge, so to speak. Let's start with your time at the State Department. I know you started there young in your career, but we hear a lot of things about the political environment over there in Foggy Bottom. Not always great things. So what was your experience?
So I think it's really important kind of to set the stage for the audience about the Department of State, what President Trump refers to as the deep state. One of the things that happens just by evolution, we'll say, is that Foreign Service officers sometimes find themselves serving in foreign countries and representing the interests of those countries over the interests of the United States, the country they're there to serve. And so you end up sometimes with these kind of twisted perspectives on what should be in America's national security interest, as opposed to, and the bilateral relationship between the United States, whom you're representing, and the host country. That's something that I think we see play out with Foggy Bottom today, Foggy Bottom of yesteryear, and no doubt Foggy Bottom moving into the future.
A little bit of clientitis, as
That's
it were.
what it's called.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what about your time at USAID? What does that entail? I mean, working for this agency, I think, we think about just money that we're providing or assistance that we're providing to a whole bunch of countries that need it. Is that the beginning and end, or is there more to that?
There's a lot more to that. The first thing I'd say about USAID, and it's important for Americans to understand, is America is the most generous country in the history of the world. And American taxpayers who fund USAID entirely, American taxpayers provide probably around $40 billion a year. Yes, your eyebrows went up. It's a big number. $40 billion a year through USAID as the primary delivery mechanism for helping countries along their journeys to self-reliance, economic development, and but also when there are emergencies. So if there's a hurricane or an earthquake, American assistance is there, Johnny on the spot. The issue becomes one of how is this perceived USAID has been around for over 60 years. It started under President Kennedy. Is this having a positive impact, a negative impact, or in many cases, I would contend, kind of no impact? It's almost taken for granted that America will be there. What we saw at USAID and we're seeing across U.S. international relations is China, on many levels, does a better job of reminding countries that it is there to be what the Chinese would call helpful. China ends up, in many cases, indebting countries to China. America gives willingly, as I said, very generously. But sometimes I think, and we'll start to see this probably in the next Trump administration, with an expectation that American largesse is recognized.
Interesting. I mean, obviously, we hear a lot about debt trap diplomacy that the Chinese have been conducting through what we call their Belt and Road program. But yeah, we have a kind of we have a little bit more of a strings attached approach when we provide aid, right? I suppose we ask for better performance in terms of governance or corruption or terror support or things like that. And the Chinese don't do that, but they leave people on the hook with the massive amount of debt. And I guess we need to figure out how to straddle those two models, and we haven't quite done that yet.
Right.
Well, I want to talk about UNRWA for a minute, the UN Relief and Works Agency. I know you're not a big fan. I've been watching what you've been writing about this particular agency, and I suppose that dovetails a bit with your time at USAID, given how much money we've provided this one U.S. agency, or UN agency, rather. So tell us, what are you tracking right now as it relates to UNRWA?
So UNRWA, which stands for the United Nations Relief Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA is and has shown itself to be, since October 7th, 2023, a wholly corrupt UN entity funded with donor tax dollars and complicit with Palestinian terrorists from Gaza to Judea and Samaria to Lebanon to Jordan. And UNRWA is run by, at the executive level, by Europeans, usually Swiss, and because it has major offices in Geneva, but it also is populated. The workforce, 30,000 strong, is Palestinians. And what my favorite NGO, the UN Watch, which is a watchdog organization calling out corruption across the entire UN system, UN Watch has been trying to deliver to UN headquarters, to UNRWA, to spokespeople, its latest report, which I'll hold up here, The Unholy Alliance, UNRWA, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad. UN Watch has cataloged efforts by Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, to co-opt UNRWA staff to the point where UNRWA staff are dual-hatted in thousands and thousands of cases, terrorists and in receipt of UNRWA salaries. It's a hotbed of corruption, and America, under this administration, has been funneling close to $500 million a year to UNRWA for its operations. In the Trump administration, when I was the deputy administrator at USAID, we cut all funding to UNRWA. I suspect that come January 20th of this year, the spigot will turn off once again.
And that would be good news, obviously. And but obviously, we also have seen that the Israelis have actually banned UNRWA. So that means that officially, right now, the Israelis are not facilitating the entrance of UNRWA into the Gaza Strip or into the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. And so that's going to be interesting as well. But let me ask you something else, speaking of just January 20th. And I mean, it's a question that I know you've been noodling. What does it mean that there could be hell to pay if Hamas doesn't return those hostages? I know this is what President-elect Trump threatened, but what does it mean in your view? How would you interpret this if a deal is not struck?
If a deal is not struck, I think what we revert to is what Prime Minister Netanyahu's original war plan was: the complete dismantlement of Hamas, such that it never has a chance to run Gaza, run the Palestinian Authority. It will be completely decapitated, neutered, and run out of existence. That's what hell to pay for Hamas means. Largely, that work will be done by the IDF. But what Trump means when he says that, I believe, is that we will not get in Israel's way of the complete and utter destruction of Hamas while rescuing the remaining 100 or so hostages. I say or so because it looks like there are now 98 people being held hostage by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and regular old Palestinians in Gaza.
Yeah, I do wonder when we talk about that hell to pay, this is something that I've noodled on this show, this question of whether that means that Iran pays more of a price economically because of their patronage to Hamas. But then there's also countries that President-elect Trump has traditionally been somewhat friendly to, countries like Turkey and Qatar, which are patrons of Hamas. So the question becomes, does the president-elect begin to squeeze these countries despite his record of perhaps friendship with these nations? So I think, some big questions linger. Yeah.
Yeah. I think President Trump views friendship that gets played out in our mainstream media in a way that is very calculating. And he's not buddy with Erdogan, but he'll talk to him. And I think it's important to maintain these dialogues. It's important to maintain the dialogue with Qatar, recognizing that you're talking to a theocracy. Same with, Erdogan, who supports the Muslim Brotherhood. You're talking to a theocracy that fundamentally has been supporting some of the worst terrorists in the world. You can be polite, you can express America's interests, but the dialogue itself is important. And I think that that's where President Trump comes down. He's not going to be playing golf with them, but he is going to be talking seriously. Senator Rubio, when he becomes Secretary of State, will be speaking very seriously with these theocrats and ensuring that their interests align with ours. Turkey is a NATO member. Qatar is, thank you, Joe Biden, a major non-NATO ally now. That status could go away. It's harder to move Turkey out of NATO, of course, but Qatar's position vis-a-vis the United States, the air base in Qatar, that's a somewhat more precarious position for the Qataris to be in.
Yeah, I totally agree. But now you've got me thinking about Recep Tayyip Erdogan in a golf outfit out there playing golf with the president. I'm not going to be able to erase that from my head anytime soon. Since you served in the last Trump administration, I do want to ask you before I let you go, just to take out your crystal ball for a minute. What are some policies you might expect the incoming Trump administration to implement in those first 100 days? I mean, that's the metric we all watch in the swamp here, those first 100 days. What do you think? I don't know, 1, 2, or 3 ideas are that we should see implemented with Trump returning?
I think it's hard to get a lot done in the first 100 days. In the first Trump administration, it was extremely hard because there was no footprint for the administration in Washington, D.C. The second Trump administration has had 4 years to plan out what its first 100 days might look like. I think principally, we're going to see domestic policy changes. And so Trump won because of immigration, and he won because of the economy. So I think we'll see a lot of activity on the border. But I do want to point out that yesterday in the House of Representatives, they passed a bill legislating sanctions on the International Criminal Court in The Hague. That's the ICC. It's a kangaroo court that has sanctioned Netanyahu, as you said, to call him a war criminal and make it impossible for him to carry out his own country's international relations for fear of being arrested. The Congress the House has passed that. I suspect it'll pass the Senate, and it'll be signed into law by President Trump within those first 100 days. The ICC is bad not just for Netanyahu, but it's bad for us. American soldiers posted overseas could be arrested as war criminals for existing, because somebody in some country somewhere has a beef against the United States. So that'll be, I think, probably the first that we see.
Yeah, and as always, Israel is the canary in the coal mine.
Right.
I would probably also argue that we'll see the return of those sanctions against the Houthis. It was added by the Trump administration, the outgoing days of the administration, removed in the early days of Biden. The Houthis have become something of a partisan issue, so I expect that to happen as well. But we're going to leave it there. I want to thank you, Bonnie Glick, for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
All right, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. Check out an important piece in the Washington Examiner by my colleagues Jonathan Saya and Saeed Ghassaminejad. They reflect on the setbacks of the Iranian regime and its proxies. Hamas and Hezbollah are severely weakened. The Assad regime in Syria has been overthrown, and the skies over Tehran have been left vulnerable after Israel's precision airstrikes. My colleagues argue that these developments present a unique opportunity for the incoming Trump administration, which should adopt a policy of maximum pressure grounded in 5 key pillars: economic, diplomatic, military, intelligence, and political measures. I like the way these guys think, but will Trump seize this opportunity? We'll soon find out. FDD's Peter Duran has written a piece in the New York Post marking 25 years of Vladimir Putin's reign of terror. Interestingly, Peter argues that Vlad, as we'll call him, is now weaker than at any other point during his quarter century in power. He rules over an isolated country, fighting a messy war and racked by internal turmoil. Peter stresses that the Trump administration must capitalize on these vulnerabilities by maintaining a firm stance against Russia while supporting American allies that are committed to resisting Moscow's ongoing aggression. Finally, be sure to check out FDD's recent media call, which previewed the upcoming TikTok case before the Supreme Court. The court will hear arguments on the social media platform's systematic indoctrination of American youth by minimizing or suppressing negative content about China. This form of information warfare, particularly aimed at impressionable young minds in the United States, demands urgent attention. FDD's experts break it all down for you in plain English. You can find the transcript and video on FDD's website. That's going to do it for today, folks. If you're looking for something smart to read, just look for the expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD. Check out our Instagram and YouTube channels if you're up for it. And feel free to just go ahead and make that tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Monday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief. I'll be relinquishing my host duties, but you'll be in good hands. My colleague, Rear Admiral Retired Mark Montgomery, Senior Director of FDD Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation, will be taking the reins. He knows a ton about a ton, from the Middle East to Russia to China to cyberspace and beyond, so please do tune in. Until next time, I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.